So Broccoli is Ember's asset pipeline. And an asset pipeline is simply something that takes raw JavaScript and CSS and images and stuff and basically prepares a package that is ready to deliver to the browser, right? So this takes care of transpiling your next generation JavaScript into stuff browsers can read. If you're using less or Sass, this is where it becomes CSS. There are even tools for automatically compressing images. So you can just rest assured that if you drop images in your public folder, which is where you put your static assets, by the time you deploy it, they will have been compressed down to as small as they can possibly be while still looking the same. The important concept behind Broccoli is it is pluggable. It is designed to be extensible, meaning Broccoli itself is not really quite as amazing as the plugin ecosystem around it, right? The idea of being able to chain a bunch of plugins together. It's a different way of thinking compared to, if you're used to a grunt file or a gulp file, where basically you have these huge configurations that you have to manage on a environment by environment basis. So this is the convention over configuration approach to, build tools. It is by design not parallelized, just because that can lead to race conditions, and it essentially you can get some performance out of it, but it comes with headaches as well. So it's designed to be as fast as it can be on a single process. When you're building Broccoli plugins, you want to think in terms of trees, not files, and we'll go into what trees are in a second. But you want to be thinking in terms of a group of files as specified by a root folder, or a root folder with this extension, sort of a filter for files. And of course, the plugins are chainable, right? So this would mean that you can take your Sass and turn it into CSS, and then you can minify that CSS, and then you can add a comment to the top of your CSS, and it sort of, goes through each step of the pipeline one by one. So in terms of how to think of trees are like all Broccoli plugins, and these are the composable pieces of the pipeline that you assemble together. They will all return a new tree, right? So if you're turning Sass into CSS, you will pass some description of a set of files in, and you will get a set of files coming out, and that can be fed into the next plugin. A string is also a tree, and that just represents a folder, right? So just the string app is your whole app folder. So you might take app and then pass it into a Broccoli plugin that would filter for only those JavaScript files in whatever you gave me. And so that's how that will progress. So all plugins are either end-to-end, meaning for 5 Sass files, it'll create 5 equivalent CSS files, or they're end-to-one, which would be concatenating all of that together. So you either get the same number of things out, or you get one thing out. And you want to make sure you think of trees and these plugins as if you're working with immutable data structures. The reason here is that in your Ember CLI build.js file, which is sort of where your build process is defined, that's where you're assembling your asset pipeline. It is not used or invoked until later. So by the time you return it, nothing's been acted on yet. And a great example here is you're basically, think of it like you're returning the head node of a linked list. So in the top example here, the wrong one, you can see that we're expecting, it's almost as if we're expecting app tree to be modified by passing it into this minify plugin. And this would be just an orphaned linked list node or something that's just lying around inside this function and eventually thrown away. It's not part of what we return, and so it's not part of this pipeline that we've built. This is particularly important when you're thinking about debugging. So rather than just putting a line of code in there as if it's a console log and it'll just write something out as that line is executed, you have to put something into the pipeline that will console log or that will print something out or write some files out as that pipeline is run. So I'll show you specifically how to do that. But the key idea is act like these plugins take in a value and return another value. Act like there is no pass by reference and that you're not modifying things that are passed in. You just keep returning something new. That's where the immutability idea comes in. Just act like you return something and nothing else interesting is happening. In terms of how we build a plugin with vanilla JavaScript, so you're going to start with this Broccoli filter base class. It's a node module. It's the base class for all Broccoli plugins. And you're going to build a constructor that looks just like this. You're going to clone filters prototype. And the three bottom things are the most interesting here. There's a method called processString, which, given the contents of a file as a string, you will return a new string. So if you imagine that we were taking Sass and turning it into CSS, this is where we would use our Node.js Sass to CSS compiler, and we would compile this content, the Sass content, into CSS and emit that, right? So you have two options at the bottom, extensions and target extension. Target extension is going to define what the output is going to have in terms of a file extension. So this would be like CSS if we were transforming Sass to CSS. So the extensions option here, that is the types of files that we want this plugin to act on. So in this case, you might have both SCSS and SASS if you had a Sass to CSS compiler that handled both of those types of files, right? So it's almost like types of input files and then the single type of the output file. And again, can't stress this enough. You're assembling a chain of things, and that chain will run much later. So console logs or debugging, that has to be something that you insert into the pipeline, and you will see the result when that pipeline is run. You should not expect that whatever's happening while Ember CLI builds, function is running. Like nothing interesting is happening there except you're essentially planning out and assembling your asset pipeline. You are not building assets as you're going through that single function that Ember CLI build exports. The main hurdle when building Broccoli plugins is debugging. Use this library. It is called Broccoli Stew, and it's by Stefan Penner, who's the Ember core team member, who's one of the point people for Ember CLI and a contributor to Broccoli itself. It's basically a Swiss Army knife, and the two methods that are useful for debugging are log and debug. Log prints stuff out to your console. Debug will, at whatever point in the pipeline you hit this debug piece in the pipeline, it will essentially write out the contents of the tree, the contents of your build, to a file, to a folder of your choosing. So you'll pass in here's an example of debugging. You'll grab the debug function off of this module that's exported, and you'll build it into your pipeline like this, and you'll pass in the tree, right? The tree you got, and you'll pass in an options object that has a name as well. And so you'll see a folder called my-tree, and inside that you'll have a bunch of files, some CSS and some JavaScript and so on, and that will give you essentially like a snapshot of what the asset pipeline, what your assets looked like at that point in the pipeline. Does this make sense? Again, you see we're not just invoking debug, we're putting it into the pipeline as a unit, as a part of the pipeline, so that when it's invoked much later and we start pulling the assets through this thing, you're going to hit that debug much later on.